Africa. I remember when I was a kid, we'd say to each other, Africa is jungle. The fact is only about 10% of Africa is jungle, or less. The rest of it is mostly desert. The Sahara is not the only desert in Africa. Go to South Africa and you'll find some fairly large deserts down in the southern part of Africa also. There's a whole lot of grassland. Toward the east of Africa is the region called the Safari country, and that's where its humans are said to have originated, in East Africa. There are a lot of grasslands in Africa that are populated by wild beasts. The jungles lie in the Congo region. The jungles of the dark continent that Africa is famous for, located along the Congo, and some of those jungles are so extremely dense that it's difficult to explore them. Well, at one time we thought Africa had no history, that these people had always been the people we found them, but then we are slowly reconstructing a history and realized that they do have a history, and they were more involved in the history of mankind than we realize.
So who found them?
Who found Europeans? Mostly the Portuguese. So if you look on a map, Portugal's the westernmost part of Europe. Portuguese sailors sailed around Africa and eventually reached India by going around Africa. See, we wanted to trade with Europe wanted to trade the Far East, but between Europe and the Muslim world. And we figured if we can get our ships to go around the Muslim world, we can get better trade with the Far East. So the Portuguese led the way, followed shortly afterward by the Spanish, then the British, the countries of Western Europe, and the French also. The Dutch, they all found a way eventually around Africa.
So they were trying to get to India?
What's that?
They were trying to get to India?
They were trying to get to India, then China, particularly, and what is today Indonesia. The islands of the East Indies, India and China, and even Japan, faraway Japan, because they understood these lands were rich in trade. Marco Polo made a trip to these lands. So they were trying to get to these lands. That's what made them want to sail around Africa. And the Portuguese found them first. And but we slowly began to reconstruct their history. A lot of it was writings from outsiders who visited deep inside of Africa and would come back and tell what they found while they were inside Africa. In addition, we've studied their trade routes, their trails. Particularly in the Sahara Desert, there are some oases, and they'd cut a trail from one oasis to another, and they'd navigate the same way you navigate in the sea, navigate by the sun and the stars. And there is seldom a cloud in the Sahara Desert, so they always had the sun to go by or the stars to go by. And they could use that. Now, they could not navigate by the sands. The sands are shifting sands, and the hills that's here this year won't be here the next. The valleys, the ravines that are here today will be covered over tomorrow. But they would navigate by the same way sailors do, by the stars. Now, they left behind numerous paintings and carvings that tell us something about their life. They're apparently a hunting society. But in addition, we also have archaeology that tells us where they lived and what kind of house they lived in. But they have an oral history, tradition that's passed down from one generation to another. The old men would gather young boys around the campfires and tell these boys stories of the tales, the deeds of their ancestors. And eventually these boys would grow up, a few of them become old men themselves, and they would pass it down. And some people take these oral stories seriously, others with a whole lot of skepticism, but these stories are slowly being written down, and they might tell us something about African history if we could know what to believe. The earliest civilization we know of in Africa is a civilization of Kush. In the Bible it is known as Kush. This was a civilization just south of Egypt. The country was called Nubia. Today it's called part of the it's not Anglo, but it's the Egyptian Sudan. Nubia and Egypt apparently influenced each other, and there was a lot of trade that went on between them. Egypt conquered Nubia, and at one point it looks like Nubia actually conquered Egypt. That one of the Egyptian dynasties was black. Kush became a trading center. Again, Africa has the world's most natural resources, and the trade involved ivory, iron, gold, and slaves. Now, I want to follow on the subject of slaves. Slavery has been a problem with Africa all the way down through its history, including the year 2016. There are rumors that there is still slave trade going on in the Sudan. The United Nations has tried to intervene and tried to outlaw it. There are also rumors that slave trade is going on in the Congo. This is still, yes?
So you said that one of the Egyptian dynasties was black.
That has been rumored, suspected, yes. I forget which one. But that Nubia at one point conquered Egypt.
I'm just trying to figure out, my question was what the rest of them were they?
Oh, the rest of the Egyptian dynasties were probably all olive colored, fairly dark, but not black. But it's believed that one of the Egyptian dynasties, I don't know which one, was conquered by Nubia. I mean, it was that Nubia conquered Egypt for a while, and that Egypt had a black
I'm
dynasty.
pretty sure that there was like an ongoing like conquer, they're going back and forth. That's what I said.
It might have been. Regrettably, I don't bring my book in with me. Well, if you look on your book, at the front part of the book, they have a picture where they show Egypt with black and white intermingling together as if half the population, maybe a fourth of the population was black, a fourth was white, and the other fourth was somewhere in between. So it might have gone back and forth a lot.
How do we differentiate? I'm just asking because I'm a history major, so I'm talking like historically as a historian. How do we differentiate Egyptians from Africans if Africa is a continent?
There was a separation, between Egypt and Nubia. I mean, the Nile River runs through both, but there was an area of dry desert that somewhat gave a separation. It wasn't like, where Georgia borders Tennessee, and there's no difference in the climate from one side or the other. There was a difference in that there was several hundred miles of desert between them, and that made that isolated. There was a natural barrier. The dry desert was a natural barrier that had Egypt on one side and Nubia on the other, and with a difficult time for one group to go between them.
So essentially, these people will be Nubians and these people will be Egyptians.
They were separate, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
They were separate. Again, they traded with each other. They built pyramids. The Nubians built pyramids. Apparently, the Nubians copied the Egyptians. Even the Nubian pyramids were never more than 6 or 8 feet tall. They also had writing, which was originally was hieroglyphic writing. They copied from the Egyptians. Then they developed alphabetic script. Now, the problem with African writing, in every case, it has not been deciphered. We'll find an inscription carved, etched in stone, inscription, maybe etched in ivory, but it's not enough of it for us to copy or decipher yet. Now, someday we might find a big library, a big cache of a whole lot of writing that has lexicons and dictionaries, and we'll be able to understand their language. But that's a hope that we have. Another kingdom in Africa was the kingdom that your book calls Axum. Axum. Another name for Axum is Ethiopia. Ethiopia has been a part of human history from the very beginning. There seemed like there always was a kingdom there in Ethiopia, just quite a ways south of Egypt, but far enough removed from Egypt that it made it a little bit difficult to get to. From Egypt, you get to Ethiopia 2 ways: go down the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean from the Red Sea, and there you'd eventually land in Ethiopia, or you could go down the Nile River and then cut across the east. Ethiopia According to the biblical account, a queen of Ethiopia named the Queen of Sheba visited King Solomon. And the Queen of Sheba was highly impressed with Solomon, but according to the Ethiopian account, the Queen of Sheba became pregnant by Solomon, and they had a son named Menelik. And for them, from that day until around 1978 or 79, all of the Ethiopian rulers claimed to be descended from Solomon, the Queen of Sheba, and their son Menelik. Yes?
King Solomon, where's he's the king of what?
He was the king of Israel. The king of Israel. Solomon of Israel. Supposedly had a son, and the last of the Ethiopian rulers was a man named Haile Selassie. The name might mean nothing to you, but among African people and among Jamaican people, who are large 90% African anyway, Haile Selassie was a big, important figure. In fact, they almost worshipped him as a god. But Haile Selassie had a downfall, and Ethiopia then more or less became communistic. But for hundreds of years, right, well, Ethiopia became Christian about 30 years after Christ's stay on earth. Ethiopia became Christian, and they copied Egyptian Christianity. And unlike the other countries, they were able to resist Islam. They resisted Islam for, I guess, more than 1,000 years, but then they could not resist communism. The thing that went in Ethiopia's favor was its geography. Ethiopia was a country of steep mountains, was surrounded by desert, and the desert was full of all kinds of very deadly venomous snakes. And armies that tried to come in oftentimes were decimated by the snakes. And as recently as 1905, Italy invaded Ethiopia. The British gave the Ethiopians rifles, and how I call it rifle, the Ethiopians were able to defeat Italy, and Italy was terribly embarrassed. Then in 1936, Italy came back with planes and tanks and defeated Ethiopia, but they had planes and tanks that Ethiopia lacked. I'll be right with you. Yeah.
The first time that Italy invaded Ethiopia was what year?
Around 1905 or so.
1905.
And Italy, well, it may have been earlier than that, Italy lost. Then they came back and conquered Ethiopia, but then Italy took the side in World War II, the side they took lost. And as part of the peace treaty, they had to give Ethiopia back. So Italy did not get to keep Ethiopia long, but Ethiopia has been helped by its geography that kept them from the other countries in that region. They were not taken over by Islam. The name Axum, again, same thing as Ethiopia. Now, the Sahara Desert. Now, folk, this is straight out of your book. This is not my speculations, but it says at one time there was an ice age. Very cold climate, and when the climate got cold, Europeans migrated across the Mediterranean and lived in the Sahara Desert for we don't know how many years. Sahara Desert once was fertile, it once had a lot of rainfall and a whole lot of grassland and a lot of game. We're judging this by what they left behind, because when the people moved out, when the desert dried up, they often left behind their statues, their paintings. These paintings in the dry desert conditions lasted for thousands of years without being deteriorated. Same way with the statues. The statue shows a hunting society. So these people apparently lived on game, or they were able to grow crops. Anyway, as the climate warmed up, the desert started to dry up, and then the desert got drier and drier and drier, and as the desert got drier and hotter, all the winds were forced away from this area, which made it drier and hotter still. So one problem fed on another. And today the Sahara Desert is the world's largest and probably the world's driest and the world's hottest. Temperatures in the daytime in the Sahara can get up to 170 degrees. In fact, that's hotter than the interior of your car on a hot day. Hotter than the inside of your car. 170, 170, really, really hot. It doesn't feel that hot because the humidity is so dry. And you who played a war game in the desert like I have might know what I mean. The hottest wind temperature I was in was 129 one time. That was in the California Mojave Desert, Death Valley. But at night, that same night, the temperature got down to 34. The temperature would get up to 170 at daytime and down to 35 at night. Very, very high, but it doesn't feel that hot or that cold because there's the air is so dry. Anyway, the Sahara became an area of lakes and ponds, and eventually the lakes and ponds dried up, but there are still some of them. At first, when the Sahara dried up, people tried to cross Africa to get to the southern part of Africa, owing to the minerals that Africa had, the tin, the iron, the ivory, the gold, and the diamonds. At first, donkeys were used. Then it was found that the camel made a better desert animal than a donkey. And if any of you know anything about camels, camels can go for 3 weeks, up to 3 weeks without drinking water. They store their water in their hump. And donkeys cannot do that, so you can load up a camel. And also camels have special protection for their eyes. When the sandstorm comes up, their eyes will not be hurt by the sand. Donkeys do not have this. Donkeys have to close their eyes completely. Camels can see where they're going even during a sandstorm. So camels became the ideal animal for desert travel. And caravans of camels would cross the desert, going deep into Africa, all the way across the desert, load up wares or offload wares from Europe, load up wares from Africa, and then cross the desert again, going from one oasis to another. Now, Africa has another situation that's unique. From East Africa, and again, I wish I had a map, but from East Africa, the Far East, the winds for 6 months of the year blow toward the east. Then for 6 months of the year, the winds blow toward the west. That way a ship captain knows, well, if he's in Africa and wants to go to the Far East, when the winds are blowing east, he'll put his sails up and have the wind behind him all the way, get the Far East, offload his wares, load up their wares, and then when the winds shift, come back and have winds. And this has been going on for thousands of years. A constant steady stream of wind blowing one way for 6 months, blowing the other way for 6 more. And this led to a trade that went on between Africa and India at least, and to some extent China. It is known that some Chinese importers built very large wooden sailing ships that went to Africa, and one of them brought back giraffes and elephants and baboons, which the giraffes particularly really impressed the emperor because China had nothing like that. And of course China doesn't have very many elephants here, but they'd seen elephants in India. India has elephants, but to Africa, these animals were brought back to China from Africa. And this trade did seem to enrich the Africans. Well, a certain tribe of Africans, the Bantu, moved into East Africa. Now, the Bantu are still there. They moved in from the west, and they replaced a lot of the old population of Africans. And regrettably, though, when they did, somehow African civilization seems to have undergone some kind of a decline. Now, again, we do know this about the Bantu. They tended to be tribal, and that means they only lived in small tribes. They lived by farming mostly, and they did not generally care about trade with far distant lands. And a lot of Africa's cities just simply, they remain standing to this day but uninhabited. They became overgrown with jungle life, and people that lived there moved away. Islam came in. Islam first conquered Egypt in the northwest corner of Africa. Egypt was before this time part of the Byzantine Empire. Islam took Egypt from the Byzantine Empire, and because of the heavy taxation, a lot of Egyptians welcomed the Islamic people at first. And a lot of Egyptians converted to the Muslim faith, and they still are Muslim to this day. Well, Islam then spread across North Africa to a group of people called the Berbers. They lived along the Mediterranean coast of North Africa. The Berbers resisted at first, but eventually they succumbed. Now Mali. There's another country in Africa called Mali. Now, yes?
I just have a question. So the Islam people, I know that Islamic is like a faith, so who were these people?
Is they came out of Arabia, poured out of Arabia in droves. And first they conquered Persia, and then they conquered Syria. Then a group probably moved into Africa and conquered Egypt first. I mean, if you look on your map, if you're living in Arabia and come out of Arabia, the first African country to come to is Egypt. Then they moved from Egypt and spread into what is today Libya, and then Algeria and Tunisia, and conquered the Berber people living there. Most of the people who remained, for the most part, converted to Islam. But a whole lot of North African people moved out of North Africa, particularly moved into Europe. And one man said, before I could walk through Africa and meet hundreds of people, now I can go for 2 or 3 days at a time without seeing anybody. Because again, the people who did not want to convert to Islam moved out. But there was one country, Mali, that converted peacefully to Islam. Mali, M-A-H-L-I, it's still there. I had a pupil from Mali last semester. They converted to Islam. They had a capital, a city called Timbuktu. Now, Timbuktu is an oasis in the desert, and there used to be an expression, an old saying, as far away as Timbuktu. Well, what was Timbuktu far from? The answer is far from everything and everybody. Europeans tried for a few generations to get to Timbuktu, but the people of Timbuktu always resisted them. The desert, I mean, Timbuktu is in the middle of the desert, very difficult to reach. Eventually, though, Europeans developed trains and trucks and airplanes, and the Europeans would hear that, hey, there's this big city in the desert you can reach. Eventually, Europeans did reach it, but they had a tough time because the people there resisted the invasion of foreigners. But the capital of Mali was Timbuktu. They became Islamic, supposedly, without any forceful conversion. Ghana, that's another nation we have today. Let's see. Ghana, Mali. Ghana, Mali. These were the nations in the western hump of what's called the hump of Africa, the western part of Africa that sticks out. In southern Africa had a country called Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe got rich in gold trade. They had they got rich in gold trade, but eventually their capital was abandoned. We don't know why. Maybe because they had over-farmed the land and the land would not produce anymore. Maybe drought came. We have a whole lot of cities that we find completely abandoned. We're going to talk about one in a few weeks, a city called Angkor Wat. It was in the middle of the jungle, and one day a European stumbled on it, and oh, the city was full of snakes and wild cats, and nobody lived there. But it was a big, magnificent city. Well, the capital of Zimbabwe was the same way. And again, we don't know why. Eventually, what happened to the people who lived in that region, they became tribal people. Small, independent tribes. Some of them would cooperate and merge. But oftentimes, they would, even when they tried to merge together, they would have some quarrel and fall apart. It was these people who, unfortunately, were the ones who were taken as slaves when the slave traders came in. Among the people are the pygmies. The pygmies are the shortest humans on Earth, oftentimes no more than about 4 feet tall, or even shorter than that. The pygmies and the Bushmen. The Bushmen are another tribe of very short people. Yeah, I'm talking about the area around near Zimbabwe.
You said they would take the slaves?
The people who were made slaves were mostly the tribal peoples. The people who did not have a king. These are, when Europeans came into Africa, they found mostly tribal peoples and not very many states. And of course, if you go into more detail, there was a rumor that there was a Christian king deep in Africa named Prester John, and he had a big kingdom, and if Europeans could ever unite with this man named Prester John, they would drive out all of Islam. The problem was Prester John did not exist, neither did his kingdom. We know that now. But they were hoping they'd find this magnificent kingdom deep in the heart of Africa somewhere, and they would convince Prester John, this Christian king, to take up the war against Egypt. That's not part of the lesson. Yes?
I read somewhere that that one of their intents was to spread Christianity.
One of the what?
When they were looking for that person,
Oh yeah,
whatever his name was,
Prester John.
Pastor John, because they were trying to spread Christianity. He was supposed to be Christian, so they were going there.
They went in there to look for him and never found him. Yeah, never found him. And to elaborate a little bit more on slavery, we know that the ancient Egyptians had practiced slavery. In some societies in Africa, 75% of the people were slaves, and in other cases, as little as 10%. Generally, the persons who served in royal households were treated worse than the other people. It's been a problem in African history all the way down through history that doesn't seem to have an end. Their religion, as was true of a lot of ancient peoples, it appears that originally they believed in one God. Now again, this is controversial, but the book calls them, they believed in a creator God, but this creator God had set forth a pantheon of a whole lot of lesser gods, and therefore they tended to worship the lesser gods more than the creator God, whom they felt like was too distant, too busy to tend to them. And again, you find this same tendency among the people of India, the people of China, and the North American Indians, where they worship the Great Spirit. You find this tendency of people to tend to want to worship many lesser gods rather than the one God who they knew had created all. The way they communicated with the gods was through ritual. They would do dances and music, dances, drum beats. They would communicate with the gods this way and expect to receive an answer from the gods, and by this means. Shamanism was a big part of African religion. Shamanism was where a shaman would take some kind of drug to go into a trance-like state, and we believed that what he dreamed about when he was in his trance-like state was a message from the gods. And again, folk, I have to tell you, some of the shaman cures are known to be good cures. Some of their medicines are known to be right. They can get the right kind of herbs. So I'm not going to say it's all fakery and quackery, even though in no way do I condone it. Shamanism is usually associated with primitive peoples. The Chinese had shamans in their court for a while, in the emperor's court for a while, but eventually the emperors drove them out. Ancestors were extremely important to the African. They tended to name their ancestors. They would name their ancestors back for many, many generations, and oftentimes they would worship their ancestors. Again, we find highly advanced people doing this, among them the Chinese, and it's believed the Greek gods, the Greeks may have been worshiping their ancestors also. So among a lot of peoples, they would worship their ancestors. Islam came in, and a lot of Africans embraced Islam. But Islam had a few problems with Africans. Number one, Islam, and this is very important, Islam has no priest. No priestly mediators. Everyone in Islam has direct access to Allah. African religion called for priests, particularly shamanism, called for a highly trained, skilled person to communicate with the gods. So the lack of priesthood conflicted with the traditional African religions. Traditional religions did have priests, Islam did not. Also, and this is in your book, folk, and you can decide, is African practice of polygamy conflicted with Islamic traditions? As with Christianity also. I mean, a lot of Africans, men had as many wives as they could take in. And Islam did allow a man to take in 4 wives, but a lot of African people, men would take in more. And again, Islam had no way to deal with this. And I will say this about Christians missionaries also came to Africa and ran into the same problem, with the result that David Livingstone, for instance, finally just gave up being a missionary and became an explorer because he said, I don't know how to handle their tradition of the men having so many wives, and he didn't believe in that, so he finally just more or less gave up and turned the missionary work over to someone else. So among Africans, polygamy, that is more than one wife, was the norm, and a lot of African women also had more than one husband. Again, this was the norm. Now, in a lot of African societies, men could only pass their inheritance to their sisters' children. In other words, if you build up an inheritance, your inheritance when you die would go to your sister's children, not to your own. And the reason for this, folks, and again, I don't appreciate nobody commenting on it, but the reason for this was you always know who the mother of a child is, and oftentimes you don't know who the father is. So they were sure that, hey, if the woman was your sister, if you and her had the same mother. So in other words, what if someone said, oh, but we have the same father? Well, that didn't count. But you were sisters, brother and sister, if you had the same mother. And when you died, if you were a man and you died, your inheritance went to your sister's children because you were sure that they were blood relatives if you had the same mother. This is in your book. So African art, African music. The art and music mostly had a religious function. It was oftentimes used to communicate with the spirit world. The shamans or the priests would oftentimes put on a big mask that was a picture of their gods to, again, to attract the gods or get the attention of the gods. The art had a whole lot of emphasis on sculpture, more so than paintings, even though they did have painting. The music had a very heavy rhythmic beat, very strong drum beat. Yes, they had the xylophone, they had stringed instruments, and of course they had the drum. The string, but a lot of emphasis was placed on the beat. Africans would sing about their gods. African men would sing about their girlfriends, their wives, or whatever. So the music had a lot to do with love and romance, as well as with their religion. All right, what I'm going to do now with the rest of the time, we have a few minutes, I want to go back over and see if there's anything I might have missed that you'll need to know come Monday. Oh yes, I wanted to tell you about the test Monday. You do not need a Scantron. It's going to be the same format as the person who was supposed to come here to take the makeup didn't. But basically, this is not the test. It's in this format right here. And on the back, you'll see some possible answers, just like you do the others. I say possible. Some of these will be answers, some of them won't. What I did, I made up something like 60 definite words to define. I gave you 30 of them, the other class the other 30.
Did you know that last class you gave my test was 39 questions?
30, yeah. Okay. All right. Let me tell you, I mean, I was going to try to keep it public. The last time I gave a test in this class, I goofed. Some of you got a 33-question test, some of a 39-question test. The questions are mostly the same. I graded according to percentage. The ones who got a 33-question test got 3 points apiece for everyone right. The ones that got a 39-question test got 2.5 points apiece. I hoped, I mean, that was as fair as once I'd done it, there was nothing I could do about it. I made sure that doesn't happen again. I separated the 33 from the 39s, but some of you got one test, some of you got another. And I don't think it made a big difference. Most of the questions were the same. The 39-question test was the one I made up later. Here is one question that would give 10 points, and that's why last semester most everybody made a pretty good grade on this test. 10 points over and above what you otherwise would have made. There's 5 places where that Islam comes into conflict with the United States Constitution.
There's 5 places where
Islam and the United States Constitution do not agree. There actually are more than that.
Islam
The United States Constitution says, Islam says, areas where they disagree.
No, I'm asking is the Islamic Constitution of the book.
There is no constitution as such. I mean,
Oh, you
it's
mean their
Islamic
faith?
beliefs.
Their
Islamic
beliefs,
beliefs,
okay.
yeah. I mean, yeah, where does Islamic beliefs conflict with the United States Constitution?
And by
So should we
Constitution of
also like,
America, you mean the
The America, the United
American
States.
states.
Yeah, well,
Or Constitution?
okay, what the actual wording is, the Constitution. Yeah, the Constitution, not American beliefs. But the Americans believe different things, but we have a document called the Constitution.
That's what I'm trying to figure out. You talking about the Constitution, right?
Yeah, the United States Constitution, the United States Constitution conflicts with Islam in several areas. All right, they have Islamic beliefs in the Constitution. All right. Now, let's see, what else? I want you to be able to name 2 inventions Muslims gave to the world, and all of them were way back yonder. Among the Indians, think of
Say that again?
among the Indians, think of 3 or 4 things that the Indians did not have. Like, for instance, in the way of animals, the Indians did not have the camel, the horse, the pig, the cow, the sheep, the ox. In the way of plants, they did not have rice, wheat, barley, oats. Those plants they didn't have. Animals they did not have. Also, they didn't have the horse, didn't have the sheep, didn't have the cow, the pig. When I say the horse, that meant they didn't have any equines. That includes the pony, the donkey, the mule. They didn't have equines. Have some idea who the Pueblo Indians were, and tell me what part of the country they lived in. When you say Pueblo, all right, I'll give you an answer right now. Pueblo, near southwest United States, near what is today New Mexico, or in what is today New Mexico, that region. Hopefully you all know what Indian mounds were used for. The Indians were great mound builders. The first Europeans we have documented who came over was not Columbus. The first Europeans were the Scandinavians, people from Norway, Sweden, Denmark. The Scandinavians, we call them the Vikings. Who was the founder of Islam? Hopefully all of you know that. And know Islamic terms like Kaaba, Hijra, Jihad, Quran. One of the questions, again, I don't know if you'll get this question in other class, but one of the questions that I've got on my test here in front of me, name 5 things Muslims believe. They believe in no alcohol, no games of chance, extreme modest dress for women, subservience, submission to authority, no tobacco smoking, even though that was not part of Muhammad's teaching, but it's been added later. Don't play dice, don't play cards, don't roll dice.
Something about sex.
The 2 Muslim cities where it started, Mecca and Medina. Muhammad made a flight from Mecca to Medina. Two diseases that did a lot to wipe out the American Indians once they came into contact with Europeans were smallpox and typhus. Smallpox, we don't have it around much anymore, but in my lifetime there have been a few cases. Typhoid fever, typhus, killed my grandma Cunningham in 1926, 90 years ago in December. Today we don't even have typhoid fever anymore, but as recently as 1926 it killed a lot of folk. They did not have any idea how it spread. It killed many, many an Indian. The Nazca lines, oh yes. Those long, miles long straight lines that you'll find in South America, and also some of them are not, some of them are in the shape of animals. And they're so big that you cannot see them. So big you cannot see them.
In the shape of animals?
Some of them are in the, yeah, some of them are animals.
What did they were called?
Nazca lines, Nazca. When I say they're so large, it wasn't until we flew over in an airplane that we began to realize, hey, these are animal shapes. On the ground, you can hardly tell the lines from the ground around them. And yet you get high in the air and they show clearly.
It was like chalk or what?
Actually, it's just different colored stones. Slightly different colored stones that's located along the lines as opposed to the rest of the countryside does not have them. Again, if you're down on the ground and walking on, you wouldn't even know that you're walking on an Nazca line.
Like mosaic?
No, it's not mosaic, it's not the right word to describe it. Just a bunch of rocks laid out, just laid out. Yeah, not even really a mosaic, but when you get in the air, high in an airplane and look down, you see them. On the ground, you have to look twice to notice them. Name at least 2 Indian nations that practiced human sacrifice. Oh yes, I had a student from another country, had a really hard time with this one. I talked about the Bering Strait. Now there's 2 meanings to that word straight. The word straight in geometry means a line that is not curved. But in geography, the word straight means a small body of water between 2 bigger bodies of water. The Bering Strait is a small body of water that separates Alaska from Siberia. There's another strait in the middle, in Europe, between Europe and Africa, called the Strait of Gibraltar. The Strait of Gibraltar separates the Mediterranean on the one hand from the Atlantic on the other. So the word strait in geography means, I'll try to draw it. The word strait means like this is Alaska. And then this is Siberia, and here's the Arctic Ocean, here's the Pacific Ocean. The word strait here means a small body of water, and in the case of the Strait of Gibraltar, you have Spain down here and North Africa here, and here's the Mediterranean, here's the Atlantic. The strait is the area that separates the Atlantic from the Mediterranean. So it has 2 words, but she was thinking that the word straight means a line that is not curved. Well, yeah, that's one definition. Spelled the same way, pronounced the same way, but in all together, your dictionary would give us 2 different words with the same pronunciation, different meaning. Yeah, 2 different words.
The Bering Strait is a small body of water that separates Alaska.
Alaska from Siberia. Yeah, Siberia is part of Russia today. Yeah, Siberia, part of Russia. Let's see. Oh yeah, half the test will be on Islam. Again, I spent more time on Islam than the rest of it. Half the test will be on Islam, and half of the test will be on a fourth of it on Africa and a fourth of it on the American Indians. Notice the pack animal that's most suited to crossing the desert. That animal is not the donkey, but the camel. Not the mule, even though the camel is really the best. Mules are known for their hybrid vigor, their strength, and also their stubbornness. But they won't move if they don't want to. The word Savannah, oh yeah, we have a city named Savannah in Georgia. The word Savannah means basically grassland. Large, large area, and I don't mean grassland like the type of grass we have here that we keep mowing. I'm talking about grassland that's taller than your head. The type of grass you can get lost in if you step in because it's taller than you are, that kind of grass. Really, really tall grasslands. Now here's a question, somewhat subjective, but nevertheless I do have, I think, a really good answer for it. Why did Islam not conquer the whole world? They started, say it out loud, I see your lips. They started fighting among themselves. Otherwise, they folk they very well might have. They caught the world unprepared, but they started fighting among themselves. The biggest body of Islamic literature, I'm talking about literature now, for those who take literature. The literature is the stories that have come down to us called the, not the Quran, the Arabian Nights. And one most famous being like Alibaba and the 40 Thieves, with its famous line, Open Sesame, or Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. Those are two of them that I have read more than once. Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, Alibaba and the 40 Thieves. These are stories. Another name for them is the 1001 Nights. But Arabian Nights. Be able to tell me something about what Sharia law is. Sharia law. S-H-I-R-I-A.
Oh, if you did not go with the, whatever they wanted, you would get killed.
Yeah, it has to do with a whole lot of killing people who dissent or are different from the norm. Everybody must fit into a certain mold, and if you don't fit into a certain mold, you are killed. Sharia law kills, it advocates the killing of people who don't convert, and especially people who convert from Islam to another religion. What's that? I don't know if that's part of Sharia law or not. The jizya was the tax. J-I-Z-Y-A was the tax. I don't know if that was part of Sharia law or not.
So you would not become,
Everybody must be Islamic. And if you don't kill them, they kill women who commit adultery. They also kill homosexuals. Sharia law.
And the jizya was a tax.
The jizya, J-I-Z-Y-A, that was a tax that was only placed on non-Muslims with the intent to make sure that non-Muslims did not become richer than Muslim people. The whole idea was to make sure that the Muslims were on the top of society and non-Muslims were down below, beneath everybody else. Oh yes, one person, I don't know if I mentioned, I mentioned one time the Muslim world needed a leader. If the Muslim world needed a leader today, no telling what they might do. But one time, many years ago, they had a leader. Saladin was the Muslim leader who drove the Christians out of the Holy Land during the Third Crusade. He was the man, the First Crusade caught the Muslim world unprepared. And the Christians were able to conquer Israel, present-day Israel, conquer the Holy Land, set up a kingdom in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Well, this lasted 100 years. And 100 years later, Saladin united his part of the Muslim, not all of it. He united his part of the Muslim world. He was the leader they needed, and he successfully drove the Crusaders out of the Holy Land. And in modern times, Saladin has made news because Saddam Hussein claimed that he was descended from Saladin, and he was also claimed he was descended from Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah.
Saladin was a Muslim leader.
He was a Muslim leader.
He drove the Christians out.
Drove the Christians out of the Holy Land.
And set up a kingdom in Jerusalem.
Well, actually, no, the Muslim, probably the Christians set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. Saladin was the one who drove them out.
He drove them out of Jerusalem.
Yeah, Saladin's kingdom was very large. He was a capable warrior, but unfortunately, he did not last forever.
was that the
Did
first
it last
crusade?
100 years?
Okay, now Saladin came 100 years after the First Crusade. The First Crusade conquered Jerusalem and set up a kingdom in Jerusalem. 100 years later, Saladin came along and drove the Christians out, and the Crusades were never able to conquer it. Yes?
We have to know the dates of the crusade.
What's that?
We have to know the crusade gave?
No, I mean, I gave them, we're going to run into crusades again, we come into European history, but just know they happened. It was Europe's attempt to take the offensive and to take back some of the land that the Islamic people were taking from the Christians. Particularly the Christians felt like Jesus' country should be in Christian hands. They were not able to do it at that time. They were able to conquer later, though, when Christianity developed much better weapons. Yes?
Sorry to ask you a question, but at this point in time where the Muslims already separated.
Yeah, okay. Well, so when Islam was in Arabia, they were somewhat united as long as Muhammad did. And as long as Muhammad's uncle did, Abu Bakr. Then they started scattering out over the Persia and Syria and Egypt. And at some point they became separated and remained so. So when I say Salah united, he only united the Muslims in his region of the world.
Right, because it was the Sunnis.
There were so many, Islam was by this time spread so far that not even Salah to get them together. And again, I made mention once, and this will not be on the test, on book, that they're looking for a 12th imam who disappeared, vanished. And if they ever thinking if they can create the world that he can come back to, he'll come back. He won't unite them because they'll already be united. They need someone who can unite them all, and then the 12th imam will come back and convert all of mankind to Islam. I mean, this is fundamentalism doctrine. But it's not in the book. But nevertheless, with a little bit of research, you run into it. They believe that someday all the world will be Islamic, and then all mankind will be at peace.
And who was the leader they were waiting to come back?
The 12th imam. They had 11. We know the first 11 imams existed. Then came Imam 12, and it's questionable whether he exists or not, but Imam 12, instead of dying, he just disappeared.